A warning may come quite unexpectedly. We will now tell you what to do if a warning sounds when you are at home. And then we will explain what to do if you are out of doors. First, if you are at home. If attack is imminent, you will hear the attack sound like this.
Welcome to episode 6 of the Horror Double Bill, the show where each week we combine two films to create something greater than the sum of its parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and after last week's trip to Italy, this episode we explore the dark arts of conjure, witchcraft and ceremonial magic in a duo of films that pit the forces of reason against the forces of darkness. Before we continue, however, a very quick correction from last week's episode. In discussing Lucio Fulci, I mistakenly said that his 1980 film City of the Living Dead ended up on the British Video Nasty list, and this is, in fact, not correct. Whilst Zombie, The Beyond and House by the Cemetery were indeed all listed, City of the Living Dead somehow avoided this fate. Though, given what happens in the movie, to be honest, I'm really not sure why this was. Anyway, a lesson for me in the danger of assumption, and my apologies for getting it wrong. And after that confessional moment, we return to our usual programming and this week's pairing. First up is Night of the Eagle from 1962, which was released in the US as Burn Witch Burn, in which professional rivalries on a college campus spill over into something far more primal and far more ancient. We follow that with my favourite Hammer movie, The Devil Rides Out from 1968, which was released in the US as The Devil's Bride. This stars Christopher Lee, rather unusually representing the forces of good, in a battle for the soul of his young friend against the power of darkness. Along the way, we'll be discussing the rise of interest in the occult in the 1960s, changing attitudes in British censorship, the career and work of writer Richard Matheson, the life of notorious occultist and the so-called wickedest man in the world, Alistair Crowley, and much more. And before I begin, I would like to mention the key references that I have used for this week's episode. Now, this week we're actually covering quite a bit of ground, so these are just the main references used, and all other references will be listed in the show notes. So for Night of the Eagle, I have referred to the audio commentary and special features on the special edition Blu-ray release from Imprint Films. I've also referred to the book English Gothic, Classic Horror Cinema 1897 to 2015 by Jonathan Rigby, an article and review of the film on the website peterwingard.uk, an online article entitled Lust, Women and the Devil, 7 Decades of Conjure Wife, and that was written by John O'Neill and published on blackgate.com, and an article by James Vernier called Boo, a Spellbound Revival for Burn Witch Burn, and that was published on the Boston Movie News website in 2024. And for The Devil Rides Out, I have referred to the books The Hammer Story, The Authorized History of Hammer Films, and that's by Marcus Hearn and Alan Barnes, the book Hammer and Beyond, the British horror film by Peter Hutchings, and the Jonathan Rigby book that I mentioned a few moments ago. I've also referred to various features on the Criterion Blu-ray release, including cast commentaries and the documentary Black Magic, The Making of The Devil Rides Out. Both of this week's films explore what happens when the facade of reality is stripped away, and you discover that what you once thought were myths and legends are in fact completely true. Both also represent a turning point in horror cinema, where the occult and the magical arts really came to the fore, reflecting changes not only in cinematic taste and censorship, but also in a society that was rapidly embracing alternative cultures and belief systems. Although there had certainly been references to witchcraft and magic in earlier British movies, for example the 1948 movie Queen of Spades, and a seemingly endless number of adaptations of Faust, in Britain the cinematic journey arguably begins with Night of the Demon, released in 1957, also known, in a slightly truncated form, as Curse of the Demon in the US. Directed by Jacques Tourneur and adapted from Casting the Runes by M.R. James, it's a story that pits a rational and scientifically minded hero against the supernatural, an idea that is also explored quite extensively in the first of this week's pairings. Then in 1960, the City of the Dead, or Horror Hotel as it was known in the States, introduced audiences to a witch cult hidden in the swirling fog of a supposedly modern New England, and invokes the spirit of the Salem witch trials. A very effective film that still has the power to startle even today, this was soon followed in 1962 by our first film this week, Night of the Eagle, which opted for a slightly more grounded narrative and presented witchcraft as something very real, but also very domestic and very suburban. Then came Witchcraft in 1964, directed by Don Sharp, and starring a sadly deteriorating Lon Chaney Jr. This was a late career performance in which he plays the descendant of a persecuted witch clan. Although somewhat of a poor relation to the films I've just mentioned, much like them, it plays with the idea of brash modernity coming into conflict with powers that it can neither comprehend nor really fight against. And these narratives found a receptive audience. The 1960s marked the beginning of a dramatic shift in religious belief across the West, and in Britain, Church of England attendance had already begun to drop. In the 1950s, around 10 to 12% of the population attended weekly church services, but by the mid-1960s, this had fallen to below 7%. Population surveys taken around the same time reveal that only 28% of British adults claimed to attend church once a month, and those identifying as having no religion began to rise steadily. This was particularly true among the young, the university educated, and those living in city areas. In the United States, the figures told a largely similar story. Weekly church attendance fell from about 49% in the late 1950s to around 43% by 1970. The number of Americans identifying as having no religion doubled, and among students and those involved in the counterculture, the rate was far higher. Traditional Christianity was in retreat, but the need to believe in something was certainly not. The 1960s were known as the Age of Aquarius, denoting a period of boundary violation, carefree abandonment, and spiritual exploration. Astrology columns began appearing in mainstream newspapers. Books on palmistry, divination, and ceremonial magic hit the stores, with Sun Signs by Linda Goodman becoming an international bestseller when it was released in 1968. Tarot cards were sold openly in high street bookshops. Spiritualism grew in popularity, and paganism, long suppressed or treated as folklore, saw a resurgence through the rise of Wicca, thanks in large part to the writings and public persona of Gerald Gardner. By the late 1960s, thousands of people in Britain identified privately or publicly with some form of pagan, magical, or esoteric belief. In the United States, in 1966, the Church of Satan was founded in San Francisco by Anton LaVey, while down the coast in Hollywood, celebrities, of course, dabbled in the spiritual. The Beatles visited Indian gurus, and not to be outdone, Rolling Stones muse Anita Pallenberg introduced Mick Jagger to underground director Kenneth Anger, leading to their collaboration on the short film Invocation of My Demon Brother in 1968. As always with such things, particularly where celebrities are involved, the line between actual belief and spiritual posing grew increasingly blurry, much like the Kabbalah trend of the late 1990s. But it cannot be denied that people were looking for meaning and spiritual fulfillment. It's just that they weren't looking for it, in church. And then, on April the 8th, 1966, Time magazine decided it was time to add some gas to the flame, and it published a cover story asking, quite blankly, "Is God dead?" This was the first cover of the magazine that had ever run without a front-page image, and it caused both outrage and sensation, tapping into the growing sense that traditional religious frameworks had lost their authority. Meanwhile, back in the UK, the British Board of Film Censors began to slowly change its stance towards witchcraft in movies. For decades, the BBFC had enforced a highly conservative framework, often grounded in Christian values, national decency, and social responsibility. The occult, especially depictions of Satanism and black magic, was historically viewed as morally dangerous and even blasphemous, particularly when presented seriously rather than as an adjacent to fantasy or folklore stories. But after the appointment of John Trevelyan as the BBFC secretary in 1958, the organisation slowly began to adopt a more liberal stance towards adult material, providing, of course, that it could be justified narratively or artistically. Films that depicted witchcraft and Satanism were given greater freedoms, providing that they preserved a recognisable moral order. Evil could certainly be depicted, it just wasn't going to be allowed to triumph. Not that it was all plain sailing. In 1964, the British-US co-production of Mask of the Red Death, from producer Roger Corman, featured Vincent Price as a devil-worshipping Prince Prospero. This idea had been suggested by co-writer Charles Beaumont, who we will hear about again shortly. Featuring a ritualistic marriage to Satan himself and a violent bird attack, the film places devil worship front and centre. However, when presented to the BBFC, these scenes were drastically cut, with the Black Mass sequence largely removed altogether. So, while attitudes may have been slowly relaxing, there was still very much a line drawn in the sand. In 1966, Hammer Studios released The Witches, which was adapted from a novel by Nora Lofts and scripted by Nigel Neal, who we are going to be talking about in a few weeks' time. The story of a schoolteacher uncovering a coven in a small English village, the censors allowed it through with only minor adjustments, their main concern being a scene involving children in a pagan rite. And then came Rosemary's Baby in 1967, first as a novel from Ira Levin and then a film in 1968. The novel sold over 2 million copies in its first 12 months and tapped very much into the fears articulated by the Time cover story. Then, in 1968, Hammer released the second of this week's films, The Devil Rides Out, which was directed by Terence Fisher and starring Christopher Lee. This is possibly one of the most significant occult horror movies of the period, and was surprisingly passed by the censor after only minor alterations. And a bit more on that later on. By the early 1970s, the occult had become almost ordinary in horror cinema. Cry of the Banshee in 1970 and Blood on Satan's Claw in 1971 both explored witchcraft in rural settings and were also key entries in the folk horror movement. These films, along with A Wicker Man in 1974, suggested that the occult wasn't something that was foreign or exotic. It was pre-Christian, ancestral, and buried just below the surface, or in some cases, buried in a field in Oxfordshire. And then in 1971, William Peter Blatty published The Exorcist. This novel sold over 3 million copies in its first year, and when the film followed in 1973, it didn't just break box office records, it was a cultural phenomenon. Audience members fainted at screenings, religious groups protested, and people queued around the block to see it, sometimes more than once. Blatty, a Catholic, says that he wrote the novel not to scandalise, but to describe a world that he saw drifting away from God, and the film has retrospectively been called the greatest advert for the Catholic Church ever created. By this point, the occult, a word that has its origins in the Latin word for hidden or secret, wasn't hidden or secret anymore. It had become part of the mainstream, delivering the message that the world is possibly not as rational nor as easily explained as we would like to believe, something that both of this week's films announce throughout their runtime. Night of the Eagle and The Devil Rides Out were adapted from their source materials by Richard Matheson, a titan in horror and fantasy literature, and a man described as one of the greatest writers of the 20th century by no less an author than Ray Bradbury, who was no slouch in the horror and fantasy department himself. You may not be 100% familiar with the name, but I can guarantee that you will be familiar with much of his work. A master of horror, fantasy, science fiction, and suspense, his legacy encompasses novels, short stories, television scripts, and of course, screenplays. Born in 1926 in New Jersey, Matheson served in Europe in the US Army during the Second World War, and after returning home, studied journalism at the University of Missouri. On graduating, he moved to California, joining a group of writers who would eventually change the shape of American storytelling, including Ray Bradbury, Charles Beaumont, and William F. Nolan. His first published story was called Born of Man and Woman, and appeared in 1950 in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, making an immediate impact. It's a rather extraordinary piece of short fiction, and it's also one where it's best to go in knowing absolutely nothing. So that's all I'm going to say about it, other than that I like it very, very much. Throughout the 1950s, he wrote dozens of short stories, often blurring the lines between science fiction, horror, and fantasy. These included the titles Third from the Sun, which was adapted into an episode of the original Twilight Zone, and Button, Button, which was adapted for the 1980s Twilight Zone reboot, and also served as the basis for the 2009 movie The Box, which starred Cameron Diaz and James Marsden. His first published novel, a suspense story titled Someone is Bleeding, was released in 1953, but it was the following year that he published the novel that would cement his reputation, which was called, ironically enough, I Am Legend. This story of the last man on Earth surviving in a world of monsters created the template for countless apocalypse narratives that would follow. George A. Romero has cited the story as one of the direct inspirations for Night of the Living Dead, and it's been adapted for the screen multiple times, first with Matheson writing the screenplay in 1964 as The Last Man on Earth, starring Vincent Price. Then it was remade as The Omega Man in 1971 with Charlton Heston, and in 2007 as I Am Legend, starring Will Smith. Another major novel followed in 1956, called The Shrinking Man, in which a man exposed to radiation slowly but inevitably begins to shrink until his own home, with its pet cat and spider in the basement, becomes a vast deadly terrain. Matheson adapted it for the screen himself, and the resulting film, 1957's The Incredible Shrinking Man, eventually won a Hugo Award. What sets the story apart is its grounded realism, helped no doubt by Matheson setting the novel in his own actual home. According to him, he could just go down to the basement when writing, and everything that he needed for the setup was there. A year later, he published A Stir of Echoes, a novel about a man who develops psychic abilities after being hypnotized, and which would later be adapted into the film Stir of Echoes, starring Kevin Bacon in 1999. And then, in 1959, Matheson began writing for the landmark anthology series The Twilight Zone, and over the next 5 years delivered 16 episodes, including some of the most iconic entries that the series ever aired. Perhaps the most famous of them is Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, which he adapted from his own short story. William Shatner plays a passenger on a plane who has recently been discharged from a psychiatric hospital. Looking out of the window, he sees something on the wing, but no one else sees it, and no one believes him. Is it all in his imagination, or is there quite literally a gremlin in the works? This episode was later reimagined for the Twilight Zone movie in 1983, and is so iconic that it was also parodied on a Simpsons Treehouse of Horror episode. Another standout, which was also eventually parodied by The Simpsons, was Little Girl Lost, the story of a child who slips into another dimension through a crack in the bedroom wall. Her parents can still hear her voice, crying for help, but she's gone. It's a simple premise, showcasing every parent's nightmare, and arguably also a key influence on the movie Poltergeist, more than a decade later. By the end of the 1960s, Matheson had made a significant impact in cinema as well. He wrote the screenplays for several of Roger Corman's celebrated Edgar Allan Poe adaptations, including The House of Usher and The Pit and the Pendulum, both of which starred Vincent Price. As you know from the top of the show, he also wrote the screenplays for both of this week's films, and he also scripted a film called Fanatic, which is known in the US as Die, Die, My Darling, and this was for Hammer Studios, a psychological thriller and an entry in the so-called hag horror subgenre, starring a late career Tallulah Bankhead. And then, as we mentioned just a few weeks ago, in 1971 he wrote Jewel, a television film directed by a then unknown Steven Spielberg. That story, again published as one of Matheson's short works, featured a travelling salesman relentlessly pursued by a faceless truck driver on a remote desert highway, and is another example of Matheson's formula of everyday events being suddenly interrupted by something nasty and malignant. The same year, he also published Hell House, a gothic horror novel that mixed traditional haunted house tropes with scientific experimentation. He later adapted the novel for the screen himself for the film The Legend of Hell House in 1973, which starred Pamela Franklin and Roddy McDowall. Though Matheson felt that the finished product was underwhelming, it has since developed a reputation for its chilly tone and incredibly bleak atmosphere. Around this time, he also formed a very productive partnership with the American TV producer Dan Curtis, who had created the cult TV supernatural soap opera, yes really, Dark Shadows. In 1972, Matheson wrote the teleplay for The Night Stalker, followed by The Night Strangler the following year. Both were made-for-TV movies featuring a journalist, Carl Kolchak, investigating supernatural crimes. Their success led to a short-lived but influential series, Kolchak the Night Stalker. It didn't run for long, but its impact was significant, laying the groundwork for the modern paranormal investigator and directly influencing shows like The X-Files, as well as generating a short-lived remake in the early 2000s. Matheson continued to work with Curtis throughout the decade, including an adaptation of Dracula in 1974 starring Jack Palance. And then, in 1975, the pair created Trilogy of Terror, a TV anthology movie made up of 3 segments, each one starring Karen Black, and each also based on a short story by Matheson, though he personally scripted only one of them for the film. And that segment is arguably the most memorable of all 3. It's called Amelia, and it was adapted from his 1969 story called Prey. The story follows a woman alone in her apartment who becomes the target of a Zuni fetish doll, brought to life by dark forces and a seeming inability to follow simple written instructions. Despite the limitations of television budget and effects, the result is still genuinely unsettling, and once seen, it's really not easily forgotten. Rarely matched on television for its sheer feral terror, the segment is helped enormously by the performance of Karen Black in the central role. By the end of the 1970s, Matheson had become a household name among genre fans, thanks to the quality and the sheer variety of his output. Continuing to write through the 80s, 90s and into the 2000s, he was awarded the World Fantasy Award for Life Achievement in 1984 and the Bram Stoker Award for Lifetime Achievement in 1991. In 2010, he was inducted into the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, affirming his stature alongside the greats. He died in 2013, just days before he was due to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award at the Saturn Awards. By then, he had already left behind more than 25 novels, nearly 100 short stories, and countless screenplays and teleplays. Cited as an influence by Stephen King, George Romero, and Steven Spielberg, to name just a few, he leaves behind an influence that runs through everything from The X-Files to The Walking Dead. And if you are looking to explore his work, I highly recommend the collection The Best of Richard Matheson, which is available from Penguin Classics, and this includes many of the stories that I've just mentioned here. All of which brings us to the first of this week's films, Night of the Eagle from 1964, which Matheson scripted alongside Charles Beaumont. It was released in the US as Burn Witch Burn. It was directed by Sidney Heyer and was adapted from the novel Conjure Wife by Fritz Leiber. It stars Peter Wingard, Janet Blair, and Margaret Johnston. The film began over drinks as Matheson and his friend Charles Beaumont decided they wanted to collaborate on a movie. Both were long-time admirers of the 1943 novel Conjure Wife by Fritz Leiber, a book that Universal Studios had already adapted in the 1940s as the film Weird Woman, starring Lon Chaney Jr. Both writers were fully aware that Universal still held the rights, but that didn't stop them, as they both felt that the source material was far too filmic to not try. They wrote their version entirely on speculation, with Matheson taking up the first half of the script and Beaumont the second, and then they brought their drafts together into a single screenplay. According to Matheson, their writing styles were so closely aligned that blending the two halves into a coherent whole was fairly effortless. For him, writing the beginning of the film was a natural choice, saying in a later interview that, quote, "I've always preferred stories that begin slowly and build up gradually. A suspense story should start in a grounded, normal world. Then you introduce touches of unease and dread, bit by bit. And that's what we did here." End quote. Matheson and Beaumont stick pretty closely to the original novel, but years later, when approached about a possible remake, Matheson revisited Conjure Wife and realised that while they had indeed retained many of the book's strongest elements, a great deal had also been left out. Enough, in fact, that a new adaptation could still be made. The remake, though, never really emerged, though there was a pretty poor comedy called Witch's Brew that was released in 1980, and that also used Leiber's book as source material. At the time, both writers were working for American International Pictures, or AIP. Once the script was complete, they submitted it to AIP, who responded positively and agreed to pay Universal for the rights to Conjure Wife. The result was Night of the Eagle, or Burn Witch Burn, an American-British co-production that, in Matheson's view, turned out, quote, surprisingly well, end quote. Director Sidney Heyer had already made Circus of Horrors in 1960, a fairly garish but highly entertaining film about a disgraced plastic surgeon who goes into hiding in a circus and continues his surgeries, as well as committing more than one or two murders. But whilst that film was bright, colourful, and ridiculously over the top, here Heyer opted for black and white, and for most of the film, chose to imply rather than to show. In this regard, the film harkens back to Val Lewton's horror of suggestion, and more than a few retrospective reviewers have made the comparison. It's quite easy to see why, with an emphasis on moody atmospherics, shadows, and a steadily creeping sense of dread. It feels very much like the kind of film that Lewton's RKO unit would have made had it still been in existence. No surprise then that the film has won praise for its direction and cinematography, which creates a, quote, naggingly effective study of psychic attack through its visual storytelling, end quote. And now we are going to get into spoilers, so if you haven't seen the film, well, you know by now what to do. I first saw the film many, many years ago, and much as I love it, more recent viewings have given me some pause for thought, and so there is something that I would really like to get off my chest from the outset. Our protagonist, Norman, is quite possibly one of the most insufferable heroes to ever grace horror cinema. He is arrogant, supercilious, sexist, and so up his own backside that you can't help but think that Tansy would be better off dumping him and going for the university chair herself. Personally, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to believe that all of his success owes far more to his wife's magical practices than to any innate talent, intelligence, or indeed charm on his part. But that's possibly just the 21st century speaking. That being said, Matheson himself has also wondered aloud exactly how much of the male character's success in university life is down to them, and how much is owed to the magical meddling of their wives. Norman is played by Peter Wyngarde, who had briefly but memorably appeared as the ghost of Peter Quint in the 1960s film The Innocents, suddenly appearing on a bell tower and creeping up to look through a window at night, a scene which terrified me when I first saw it, and which still, quite honestly, gives me chills today. However, Wyngarde, who would go on to find fame in the UK in the TV series Jason King, was not the first choice. Horror icon Peter Cushing was originally slated for the male lead, and the studio also courted actor Peter Finch. Finch declined, and Cushing became unavailable due to illness when shooting was ready to start. It's interesting to imagine what either would have done with the role, Cushing in particular, and one cannot help but wonder what might have been. This is not to say that Wyngarde doesn't do a good job in the role. His journey from arrogance to bewilderment, and then finally outright terror, is both well played and convincing. This is particularly true of the scene where, as a once cynical man of science turned absolutely terrified believer, he performs a magical ritual to save his wife. This is also true of the film's climax, in which, pursued by a giant eagle, he runs horror-struck across the campus, eventually barricading himself in his classroom. And in this room, at the start of the film, he has given a lecture on supernatural phenomena, and that they are merely the imaginings of a weak psychology. During the lecture, he has written the words, "I do not believe," on a blackboard. Now he backs into it as he tries to evade destruction, rubbing out the word "not" accidentally with the back of his jacket. Of his role in horror films, Wyngarde has said, quote, "Night of the Eagle and The Innocents have made me overly susceptible to ghosts, strange things, and things that go bump in the night. Now I'm beginning to wonder how I stand up against the influences of witchcraft and the supernatural, which have dominated these motion picture roles." End quote. No mention there of the incredibly tight trousers that he chose to wear, which allegedly necessitated many of his scenes being shot from the waist up. He's also fairly frequently bare-chested, something that Matheson says was not in the script, and was a character choice brought to set by the actor himself, presumably to show off his muscled physique. As his wife Tansy, the studio cast American Janet Blair to help bring appeal to the international audience. An unusual casting for a horror film, Blair was better known for musicals and comedy, but she does give a strong performance here, even if the hysteria at points is a little too upfront, when it should be slightly more repressed. That being said, she does have some fine moments, most notably her horror at realizing that her magic has been exposed, and a frantic search for a witch's doll that has been hidden in their house after an evening card game. As for her memories of the film, in an interview given for a Laserdisc presentation, which gives you an idea of the timing, Blair said the following, quote, "Originally, I was told that Peter Finch was going to be my leading man, but lost no time in becoming utterly bewitched by my co-star Peter Wyngarde, who was so dramatic and sexy that I forgot I was acting. I do believe this is one of Peter's largest film roles at the time, and I remember after a day of shooting he drove me back to my hotel and we continued that atmosphere of being a happily married couple. I absolutely adored working with him." End quote. She also went on to describe her first day of shooting, which, rather challengingly, was filming the scene in which Tansy, determined to save her husband, still don't really understand why, takes on board all of the evil being directed at him and attempts to drown herself. Quote, "It was bitterly cold, and I had to go over this rocky cliff and continue to walk into the ocean for what seemed to me an eternity. By the time I was retrieved out of the water, I was frozen and soaked to the bone. One of the grips ran up to me and made me drink from a thermos which was filled with brandy. Being a non-drinker, I immediately spat it out. So much for the glamorous work of a movie star." End quote. This scene, along with the climactic confrontation, is possibly one of the most memorable in the film, showing how far Norman has travelled on his journey. But the aforementioned card game sequence is also very effective, bubbling with unspoken tension and rivalries, demonstrating the escalating dread that Matheson and Beaumont were aiming for. 4 couples sit around playing cards, in a seemingly ordinary domestic setting, but underneath the surface, Tansy is deeply afraid, trying to maintain a pleasant, hostess-like manner while dreading what she suspects is coming. At this point, the audience is not supposed to know who the rival witch might be. In fact, at this point, we don't even know that there are any witches at all. But one's eye is inevitably drawn to the almost manic energy of Margaret Johnston, who gives a quite startling performance as the antagonist, casually flicking a lighter on and off and delivering pleasantries that are loaded with subtext. It's hard to believe that, at the time of filming, she had actually pretty much retired from acting to become a theatrical agent and was representing one of the cast. She had to be persuaded by Sidney Hayers to take the role, and her portrayal is one of educated respectability, masking something far more feral and dark. It's actually no real surprise to see her revealed as the villain at the film's climax. Sneering at Norman's Aristotelian mind, she calls him, quote, a frightened schoolboy, frightened of being wrong, end quote, and then challenges him to choose between rationality and outright belief. Given that earlier Norman had said, quote, if we were to investigate all the strange rituals performed by women based on their so-called intuition, half the female population would be in asylums, end quote, it's pretty hard to know who to side with. The fact that one of his lectures, which is recorded onto a tape and sent to him in the post, is magically weaponized against him, is beautifully ironic. Sadly, Johnston herself was not that fond of the final product, later saying in an interview that she hated it. It may have been popular with audiences, but it really wasn't the kind of film that she enjoyed doing. Principal photography for Night of the Eagle began in 1961 and lasted around 6 weeks. The interiors were shot at Elstree Studios in Hertfordshire, and for the exteriors the production moved to Cornwall, using a real location to stand in for the fictional college. The result is a convincingly leafy and slightly remote campus, which adds to the film's atmosphere of isolation and unease. One of the film's visual motifs is introduced right at the start, a looming stone eagle perched atop the college, made quite naturally out of styrofoam to avoid accidental injury, or worse, were it to fall. Director Sidney Hayers returns to this image repeatedly throughout the film, sometimes framing scenes from the eagle's perspective, underlining the sense of ever-present threat that builds across the narrative. The eagle, of course, also appears in the film's climax, brought to enormous life, or possibly it's just all in Norman's imagination, as he rushes home to save Tansy. Of this sequence, director Sidney Hayers said that using a real eagle was the only way to go. He felt sorry for the poor thing, but he was very pleased with the results that it produced, especially the moment when it came crashing through the front door. He went on to say he remembers seeing the film with an audience in Leicester Square, London, and afterwards eavesdropping on 2 guys who were saying how scared they'd been. To a modern viewer, this may seem slightly unlikely, as whilst the sequence is impressively done given the time, one can still clearly see a tow rope in one moment. This, much like 1957's Night of the Demon, might have been improved all the more had they opted to go more for suggestion throughout. Matheson and Beaumont's screenplay had the original working title of Torment, but it would be retitled in the US as Burn Witch Burn, a phrase lifted directly from the script, and ironically the title of a novel by a completely different author. In the UK, of course, the title focuses much more on the film's climax and the central visual motif. Sadly, though, the differences didn't stop there. For American screenings, a prologue was added. Before the film begins, we hear the voice of an actor delivering an incantation that is meant to protect the audience from evil. Audiences were also handed a small packet of salt and a printed spell to clutch in the dark as a protection charm. This is a very William Castle-style gimmick, and it belongs, if we're honest, on a completely different movie, preferably one of William Castle's. None of this is featured in the UK release, which remained a more subtle and arguably more respectful presentation of the story. Unfortunately for me, the recent restoration by Imprint Films, which is beautifully done by the way, had to rely on the US print to work from, and so now I'm stuck with that prologue, and I have to hit the skip button every time I watch the film. On its release in 1962, Night of the Eagle received a largely positive critical response. The New York Times called it, quote, quite the most effective supernatural thriller since Village of the Damned, end quote, and went even further, going on to describe it as, quote, perhaps the best outright goose pimpler dealing specifically with witchcraft since I walked with a zombie, end quote. That's high praise indeed. In the UK, the Monthly Film Bulletin was a little more cautious. They took issue with what they saw as a quite unbelievable premise, specifically the idea that two intelligent and rational women might fall under the spell of witchcraft and black magic. And quite frankly, that sounds like they've spent too long listening to one of Norman's lectures. But even they acknowledged that the direction was fresh and exciting, and the way that the film suggested unseen forces at work was especially effective. A standout for them was Margaret Johnston, who they said brought a genuine sense of menace with her, quote, wild-eyed, madly frustrated performance, end quote. The film was even nominated for the 1963 Hugo Award for Best Dramatic Presentation. It didn't win, but the nomination alone speaks volumes. As time has passed, the film's reputation has only grown, seeing it celebrated for its lean, carefully structured narrative and its restrained, suggestive approach to horror. In setting its magical narrative in modern-day academia, it serves as a bridge between the older Gothic traditions and the more modern anxieties of 1960s Britain, effectively laying the path for what was to come next. All of which brings us on to our second movie of the week, and this is The Devil Rides Out. This was released in 1968 by Hammer Studios and was directed by Terence Fisher. It's based on a novel by Dennis Wheatley and stars Christopher Lee, Charles Gray, Leon Green, Nike Arigi, and Patrick Mower. I first saw this movie as part of the BBC horror double bills back in the early 80s, and I think I must have been probably about 11 at the time. I remember it making a very strong impression on me, particularly with its two main set pieces, and it's still my favourite Hammer movie. Personally, I think it showcases one of Christopher Lee's greatest performances, certainly his best in a horror movie, at any rate, and he is more than matched by Charles Gray, who plays the antagonist MacArthur, and also, if we are honest, steals about every scene that he is in. The direction and cinematography, particularly the use of colour, are superb, and the attention to period detail in terms of costume, motorcars, props and interiors is very impressive, given that the budget was £285,000, which is the equivalent of $6.5 million in today's money. And yes, the special effects are, if we're honest, a tad hokey, particularly the use of back projection and green screen. But this is a film that you get the most from by suspending your disbelief and surrendering to the story. The movie came about during a period where Hammer were in a bit of a state of flux. They had all but exhausted the Frankenstein and Dracula franchises, though they still managed to squeeze out a couple more, and were looking for new ideas. The ideal, of course, would be to find something that could be spun into a series, providing longevity that could take them into the 1970s. They had already dabbled with magical narratives with The Witches, and in the same year had also released Plague of the Zombies, where an evil squire practices voodoo and magical murder in a small Cornish village. And now they had their eye on the occult novels of British author Dennis Wheatley. Dennis Wheatley was one of the most prolific writers of the mid-20th century, and he wrote across a number of genres. Publishing his first novel in 1933, he was known as the public thriller writer #1 in the 1930s, and the prince of thriller writers in the 1940s. But his writing style and the very conservative values promoted in his work failed to move with the times, and by the 1960s, his career was very much on the wane. However, he was about to be thrown a metaphorical lifeline, and rather ironically, given Wheatley's conservative right-wing attitudes, this lifeline would come from the counterculture. The growing fascinations with spirituality, alternative religions, and the occult had not gone unnoticed in the publishing industry. Wheatley had, along with his thrillers, written a number of esoterically themed novels, and these were all quickly reprinted, with very lurid covers, in order to ride the resurgence of interest. I clearly remember seeing copies of these editions in bookcases when I was a kid, and the covers were certainly eye-catching. Often depicting a variation of a half-naked woman surrounded by flames, these were clearly designed to appeal to a male demographic, and the reprint revived Wheatley's career. The Devil Rides Out is the most famous of his novels, and it is a book which clearly demonstrates the author's fascination with, and also fear of, the dark arts. Although he was extremely conservative and Christian, he was genuinely fascinated by the occult, and he researched extensively, filling his novels with levels of detail and accuracy that contradict his more modern reputation of being something of a pulp writer. Wheatley, like his friend Christopher Lee, was a firm believer in the reality of black magic and Satanism, and believed that it was a source of great evil in the world. His books contained a clear moral message, and depicted ongoing battles between the powers of good and the powers of evil, and often incorporated historical events. For example, in his 1941 novel Strange Conflict, he depicts Nazi occultists facing off against Allied mystics, and this is a plot device that we have seen subsequently in several movies, including Hellboy in 2004 and The Devil's Rock in 2011. His 1948 novel, The Haunting of Toby Jug, is told in diary form by a traumatized RAF pilot, who has to battle Satanism when he should be convalescing. This story was eventually made into a TV drama, The Haunted Airman, in 2006, which starred a pre-Twilight Saga Robert Pattinson. He returned to themes of satanic pacts with 1953's To the Devil a Daughter, and this too was adapted for the screen by Hammer in 1976. However, they took considerable liberties with the material, and Wheatley was very displeased with the final product. He said that the film was both an awful mess and obscene, and reportedly told Hammer that they would never be allowed to adapt his work again. Later in his career, he served as the editor of the Dennis Wheatley Library of the Occult, a series of reissued books that included supernatural stories from the likes of M.R. James, as well as more esoteric work from the likes of Alistair Crowley, and a little bit more on him is coming up later. I clearly remember the collection being widely advertised in the Sunday papers, often, strangely enough, next to recruitment adverts for the religious order, or some may call them a cult, the Rosicrucians. I was firmly told that I wasn't allowed to send off for either. For Hammer, Wheatley was an obvious choice, though there was still the rather thorny issue of the censor. Though the Witches had made it through relatively unscathed, Plague of the Zombies had undergone extensive cuts at the hands of the censor during pre-production, and while the ritualistic scenes in both of these films are actually given a surprisingly small amount of screen time, Wheatley's novels put satanic rites and ceremonial magic front and centre. Given that the censor had already drastically cut Mask of the Red Death only a few years before, they were right to be cautious. And here we are going into spoilers, so again, you know what you need to do if you haven't seen the film already. Fortunately, like all of Wheatley's work, the novel is a morality play, and it has a clear message about the powers of good and their ability to triumph over the powers of evil. Yes, there may be a struggle along the way, and at points it may all seem like hope has been lost, but goodness and the power of faith will always win through, and this very clear moral framework found favour at the BBFC. Anthony Hines, the executive producer, had originally commissioned a screenplay from another writer, but the end result was reportedly too British for the international market, So Hines approached Richard Matheson, with whom he had worked on the earlier movie Fanatic, also known as Die Die, My Darling. Knowing that Hammer were making lower budget films, but that there was a class and a quality to them, and also an availability of very interesting actors, Matheson agreed. He stayed remarkably close to the source material, as was his desired practice when adapting, saying that he has never understood why studios buy novels that they then proceed to ruin in adaptation. This was an approach that he had also taken with Conjure Wife, though here, as in that instance, there were still elements that he left from the final screenplay. Matheson has said that Dennis Wheatley was so happy with the final product and the loyalty that it paid to the original novel that he sent him a thank you note. A very rare thing, indeed. The director of the film is Terence Fisher, who is widely recognised as being the best of the Hammer directors. Working with him was cinematographer Arthur Grant, and between them they created a film that is possibly one of the most visually striking of the studio's output. The use of bright colours and contrast is often extremely beautiful, particularly the witch's sabbat in the woods, where a motionless Tanith, wearing a pale pink dress, is splashed with bright red blood. This, with its appearance of the Goat of Mendes, the devil himself, is the first of the film's two major set pieces, with the second being the Night in the Magical Circle, which builds with incredible tension, if only to be let down by the special effects work. Between these two moments we have possibly my favourite scene in the movie, in which the evil Satanist McCarter mesmerises secondary character Marie Eaton into revealing far more than she should. The character of McCarter is loosely inspired by the real-life occultist Alistair Crowley, a name which still pops up occasionally in a surprising number of places, even lending itself to the character of Crowley in the TV series Supernatural, and another character bearing his name also appears in the Batman-adjacent series Pennyworth. Wheatley, who, as I mentioned, had a long-standing interest in the occult, considered the real-life Crowley to be a dangerous influence, at least until he met him in person, and used him as the inspiration for several of his fictional occultists. He was in fact not actually named Alistair at his birth in 1875, instead being named Edward Alexander Crowley. He came from a wealthy and strictly religious background, as his parents were devout members of the Plymouth Brethren, a conservative and evangelical Christian group. His father, who was a preacher, died when he was just 11, and it is believed that this, along with the strict religious education that was imposed on him, fueled his rebellion against traditional morality and religion. He studied at Trinity College in Cambridge, where he initially pursued philosophy and literature, though he never completed his degree. It was during this period that he also began to experiment with the occult, and he developed a fascination with mysticism and ceremonial magic. He also adopted the name Alistair, believing that it better suited his identity as both a poet and a magician. In 1898, he joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, an organisation that was devoted to the study and practice of the occult, and it was here that he began to seriously engage with ritual magic. But his relationship with the order was very turbulent, often marked by power struggles and personality clashes, particularly with fellow member, the poet W.B. Yeats. After falling out with the Golden Dawn, he travelled extensively, and in 1904, while in Egypt, he claimed to receive a message from a spiritual entity who dictated to him the Book of the Law. This text became the foundation of Thelema, a philosophical and magical system that he would go on to promote. This is most widely known for its central maxim, quote, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," end quote. In the early 1920s, he established a spiritual commune dedicated to this philosophy in Sicily. This was named the Abbey of Thelema, and it became notorious for its unconventional practices, including ritual magic, drug use, and sexual ceremonies. And this notoriety only intensified when a young disciple died in 1923. It was alleged that this death resulted from a ritual involving the consumption of a sacrificed cat's blood, though others claimed that it was down to drinking contaminated water. The British press, particularly the Sunday Express, sensationalised the story, branding Crowley the wickedest man in the world, and under mounting pressure, Italian authorities expelled him from the country. Throughout his life, Crowley authored dozens of books on magic, mysticism and philosophy, as well as poetry and erotica. In later years, he struggled with addiction, particularly to heroin, and he died, aged 72, in Hastings on the south coast of England in 1947. By this time, he was virtually penniless and had been largely dismissed by the public. But since his death, his influence has in fact grown, and he has become a key figure in modern occultism and counterculture movements, even being included on the cover of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album. The character of MacArthur in Dennis Wheatley's original novel is physically described as bald, overweight and soft-spoken, almost lisping. Any of these attributes actually could have described Crowley at the time that Wheatley finally met him, and this was in person in the mid-1930s, a meeting at which Wheatley perceived Crowley to be largely a charlatan. This is of course a far cry from Charles Gray in the movie, who is suave, sophisticated, dripping with self-righteous malice, and, as I mentioned earlier, steals every scene that he is in. A master of the sarcastic one-liner, scarcely in the name of God, Monsieur le Duc, his best moment comes when he calls at the Eaton's house and treats Marie Eaton, and the viewer, to a mini-lecture on the nature of the magical arts. His voice, silky and persuasive, sends Mrs. Eaton into a trance that is broken only when little Peggy suddenly interrupts. It's a masterclass of direction, editing and performance, helped enormously by the score from composer James Bernard. Watching this scene, it's quite easy to understand how MacArthur has so many people under his influence. Peggy, incidentally, is played by Rosalind Landor, who went on to appear in a sort of companion piece to this movie for the Hammer House of Horror TV series in the early 1980s. The episode is called Guardian of the Abyss, and it features Landor as a possible damsel in distress, and Hammer regular John Carlson from Plague of the Zombies as a MacArthur-type figure. If you like this film, you'll probably really enjoy that story as well, and I would highly recommend tracking it down. If you're in the UK, I believe it's actually currently on the ITV player. Charles Gray is, of course, perhaps best known outside of horror circles as the Bond villain Blofeld in Diamonds Are Forever, or as the narrator in the Rocky Horror Picture Show, and he was not the first choice for the role. They were originally going to go with somebody who more closely matched Wheatley's original description, and this is the German actor Gert Frobe. However, this did not come to pass, and the role went to Gray. Gert Frobe, of course, is now best known for his role as Bond villain Ulrich Goldfinger in the movie of the same name, so it's interesting that two soon-to-be Bond villains were in the frame for the villain in this film. 1970s horror fans will also recognise Gray from his roles in the Who is the Werewolf detective mystery, yes really, The Beast Must Die in 1974, and The Legacy from 1978. But sadly, he was also called on to contribute, uncredited, to two more 70s genre pictures. When the actor Jack Hawkins sadly lost his voice to throat cancer, Gray, who had a somewhat similar timbre, was used to dub in his dialogue. And so, if you ever watch the movie Theatre of Blood, or the movie Tales That Witness Madness, it is not Jack Hawkins' voice you're hearing, it is the voice of Charles Gray. Speaking of dubbing, this film is also somewhat notorious for the decision to dub hero Leon Green with another actor's voice, and that voice was of Patrick Allen, who was married to Sarah Lawson, the actress who plays Marie Eaton. It's rather unclear why this decision was made, though common understanding would be that it was at the request of the distributing partner, 20th Century Fox, and it was felt that a deeper and perhaps more transatlantic voice would work better. It's unfortunate then that Patrick Allen's voice would go on to become rather famous, firstly for a series of adverts that he did in the 1970s, and secondly for being the voiceover for Protect and Survive, a grim series of British public information films that advised the public what to do in the event of a nuclear war. This in turn was sampled by the band Frankie Goes to Hollywood for their #1 record 2 Tribes, and this stayed at the top of the UK charts for 9 consecutive weeks. So, if you watch the movie now, and you grew up in the 1970s or 1980s, the dubbing is pretty hard to miss. Joining Grey and Green is, of course, Christopher Lee. And as I mentioned, I think that this is his best performance in a horror film. All the more surprising, given that this is a heroic role. That being said, Lee's Duc de Richelieu is a commanding presence. He is intelligent, paternal, and only too aware of the dangers that his friend Simon is playing with. Lee, like Dennis Wheatley, had a long-time interest in the occult, though strictly from an academic point of view. This, along with Wheatley's research and Richard Matheson's screenplay, gives the character an added quality. If he appears to really understand the subject he is discussing, it is because he quite literally does, as both actor and as character. And as the Duke, his knowledge of magic is equal to that of McCarter's, creating a perfect balance of power on either side, with Simon, Tanith, and ultimately Marie, Richard and Peggy Eaton caught in the middle. After the almost technicolor brilliance of The Witch's Sabbat, we now reach the second set piece of the movie, which is the night spent by the Duke, Simon and the Eatons inside a magical circle. McCarter, on departing earlier that day, had warned that he would not be back, but that something would. Surely one of the greatest lines given to any antagonist in horror, and again, quite brilliantly delivered by Charles Gray. Following this, the Duke insists that all must spend the night in a circle of protection, and this scene is testimony to Terence Fisher's ability to build tension. Shifts in lighting, sparks from the fireplace, the camera circling the group as they stand back to back, these sequences widely recognised as the main climax of the film, with everything that follows being resolution. As I mentioned, the effects work does let it down, particularly the giant spider and the green screen around the Angel of Death when it finally appears. But the tension building is masterful, particularly the anticipation of the Angel's arrival, as we hear a horse slowly coming closer down the hallway. The rest of the cast are rather overshadowed by Lee and Gray, though Nike Origi is a striking screen presence in the role of Tanith, and it's a shame that we did not get to see her in more genre movies. A daughter of an Italian diplomat and an Australian prima ballerina, she was raised in Sydney, Australia, where her family moved when her father became the Italian consul. She moved to Paris to work as a fashion model, and then to London, where she studied acting at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. As well as this movie, horror fans may also recognise her from an admittedly small role in Countess Dracula in 1971, and the Italian giallo The Perfume of the Lady in Black in 1974. Shortly after that film, she retired from acting and worked as an artist until her death at the age of 80 in February of this year. Rounding up the cast, we have Patrick Mower, Paul Eddington, and Sarah Lawson, who are okay in their roles, though Eddington does deliver a semi-comic turn as the exasperated non-believer Richard. Of the three, Lawson is perhaps the standout, though admittedly, she is given much more to do. Richard Matheson, however, would probably disagree with me, saying in an interview in 1976, quote, "The casting was terrible, with a few exceptions, and of course they had to cut financial corners, which always damages a film. That whole sequence at the end, where they are defending themselves against the forces of evil in that big room, could have been done a lot better. But by and large, it wasn't bad. Dennis Wheatley was very happy with it." End quote. To be fair, Matheson later went on to say that he disliked the film when he first saw it because he dislikes all of his films when he first sees them, and that on reflection, he now recognises it as being far better than he gave it credit for at the time, highlighting Lee, and Gray in particular, as fantastic performances. When the film was released in 1968, critical opinion was divided. The Monthly Film Bulletin described the film as disappointingly routine, and felt that the adaptation lacked real power, whilst Variety praised Fisher's direction and the film's suspenseful elements, noting Lee's performance as a highlight. The New York Times acknowledged the film's atmospheric qualities and praised both its beautiful colour photography and Lee's performance. Audience response was also mixed, and that's something that I seem to say almost every week. And though it did reasonably well in the UK, it fared rather more poorly in the US, where it was retitled The Devil's Bride to avoid people mistaking it for a Western. It didn't earn enough to break even, and Fox considered it a loss. This, and the failure of another Hammer Wheatley project entitled The Lost Continent, put paid to the idea of a series of Wheatley films, and no more would emerge until the debacle of To the Devil a Daughter, almost a decade later. Part of the problem was perhaps the old-fashioned nature of the story itself, and of Hammer's more gothic sensibilities, which probably seemed rather out of step at the time. Compare this film to Rosemary's Baby, or even Witchfinder General, which were released the same year, and it feels very not of its time, and more the sort of film that Hammer would have made maybe 5 or 6 years earlier had the censors allowed it. Patrick Mower has recalled being disappointed by the film's rather old-fashioned stiffness when compared with the cinema that was emerging in the 1960s, though he does think now that it has aged remarkably well, growing into a classic as opposed to being seen as something that was old-fashioned for the time that it was made. Today the film is recognised as one of Hammer's best movies, lauded for its direction, its aesthetic, its screenplay, and of course the performances of Lee and Gray. For several years Lee tried to mount a remake, reprising his role of the Duke, and at that stage he would have actually matched the age of the character in Wheatley's novel. But sadly, it was not to be. This film remains the only adaptation of Wheatley's novel, and the best adaptation of Wheatley's work in general. An extremely enjoyable movie, it may require suspension of disbelief and a generosity of spirit towards its more dated moments, but if you can manage to do that, you're in for one hell of a ride. Night of the Eagle and The Devil Rides Out are of course connected by their narratives of witchcraft and magic, and the fact that these screenplays were both penned by Richard Matheson, albeit that one was a co-creation with Charles Beaumont. The films also serve as examples not only of the changing attitudes of the British film censor, but also changing social attitudes towards spiritual practice and the so-called Age of Aquarius. Together they suggest a universe in which the rational and scientific can all too quickly be ripped asunder by powers that predate modern understanding. Both films also warn that magical practice comes at a hefty price. At the end, good triumphs over evil, though, on reflection, one wonders how, after everything they've been through, any of the characters will ever be the same again. Normality, they have been told, is nothing more than an illusion, and just beneath the surface, dark and primal forces are waiting to be unleashed. And all of that brings me to the end of this week's episode, and thank you again for listening. If you're enjoying the series, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. It only takes a moment, but it really, really helps. You can also follow us on Instagram at The Horror Double Bill and email us at thehorrordouble@gmail.com. And next week we are hanging out with the kids and exploring 2 films about nightmare children. First up is The Village of the Damned from 1960, an adaptation of John Wyndham's classic sci-fi novel The Midwich Cuckoos. And then we're travelling back to Spain for Who Can Kill a Child from 1976, and this is the second feature from director Narciso Ibáñez Serrador. If you want to watch ahead, you can find both films in all of the usual places, and I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion. Until then, thank you again for listening, and have a very, very good week. Goodbye.